presentation today. And, because words matter and they can mean different things to different people, we thought it would be appropriate to center ourselves on some shared understandings of the words and concepts that we'll use throughout the presentation. So first, PWIS is a term that we'll use repeatedly, and it is the context in which we're exploring these questions today. It's predominantly white independent schools. DEIB is an acronym for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So as you all know, many schools are using different variations of these letters. So DEI or EDI. We prefer incorporating the B for belonging, and Harvard University's Culture Lab has a really nice definition of belonging as the experience that flows from participating fully in the chances that an organization offers to learn, create, discover, and achieve. People of color is another term that can mean different things to different groups, but we are using these words in alignment with the definition that's been put out by the National Association of Independent Schools, which we have on this slide. It is important to note, though, that the research that we're drawing upon in this presentation most predominantly centers on the experiences of Black students and faculty in independent schools and elite educational settings. And finally, as Carrie mentioned, or Dr. Grimes mentioned, you'll hear the words evidence-based practice. This is a lifelong learning technique that can help educators or really any practitioner within an organization to continue to improve the practice methods of the organization and approaches to really helping the organization to better live its mission. So a little bit before we start about what evidence-based practice is. The domain of evidence-based practice began in the field of medicine in the early 90s, and then it migrated into the field of education later on in that decade. There are 5 key steps of evidence-based practice that are really quite similar to the principles that underlie continuous learning improvement, and they draw from organizational behavior theories that all of us are likely familiar with. The approach typically begins with just identifying a problem or a need, and then a desire to address that problem and to improve. And it centers around this idea that there should be an ongoing iterative response to addressing the problem. The various steps that are at the center of this practice include a search for the most appropriate scholarly research around the problem, and then a gathering of data within the organization itself to gain a deeper understanding of what the problem of practice is. And that would include even anecdotal evidence of root causes that are identified by key stakeholders of the problem. And then this would be followed by analyzing the evidence to identify trends and themes that were identified, and then applying the relevant research and findings to the problem of practice while taking into account the lived experiences and values of the organization itself. And then finally, monitoring the effects of the implementation to make sure that improvement is really being made, and then trying to incorporate that information and feedback into the school's regular practice. So as you can see from this visual, it's circular. The process is intended to iterate and remain on loop. And this is especially true in areas like DEIB, where our important work is never really done. So many independent schools are, as we know, outwardly committed to increasing the diversity of the community and also to improving the climate of inclusion for its students and parents and faculty and staff. But despite these stated goals and the historical attempts in these contexts to promote a diverse and inclusive environment, the studies show that unrepresented students, and particularly African-American students, continue to describe difficulties that stem from perceived conscious and unconscious bias in the school setting. And these students have pointed to times where they've felt a range of emotions, but including being misunderstood, marginalized, and sometimes even targeted. So the primary goal of our work is to recommend achievable, sustainable, and measurable strategies that would help independent schools strengthen their efforts to build a culture of inclusion and also to foster a greater sense of belonging among the school's underrepresented students. So if you'll notice, our problem encompasses like a relatively broad issue, and it's not exclusively focused on faculty or hiring practices, but throughout our presentation, we're going to build to that as a specific change initiative that's designed to attack this broader problem of practice. So one question that we may all have in our minds is, why don't we see evidence-based practice more in the DEIB problem-solving context within our independent schools? And some of the obstacles or impediments to change or justifications that Dr. Grimes and I have heard articulated relate to a couple of different areas. One is a perceived lack of resources. So either we don't have the people or the money or the time to devote to that issue. Another is force of habit or cultural mores. We've probably all heard someone at some point in our careers say, that's how we've always done it, as a reason for continuing a practice. Competing priorities is another one. So DEIB work requires commitment across stakeholders. And I think sometimes it's hard to coalesce these different groups because different groups have different priorities. And then finally, leadership resistance would be another impediment to authentically committing to the change. So to provide a little bit of a backdrop and the historical context, there are some hard truths that we have to acknowledge about the independent school setting. Independent schools have a history of power, privilege, and exclusion that needs to be sort of factored in as we think about DEIB work. Traditional independent schools began in the Northeast in the late 1800s, and many of them began excluding students based on race and religion. And some researchers have posited that exclusion is fundamentally how independent schools created and maintained a position of power within the broader educational community, and they perpetuated this mystique of superiority. So in recent years, we've seen many independent schools across the nation be fueled by a moral imperative to remedy this history of exclusion, as well as the realization that the composition of the PWIS system doesn't reflect the world in which its graduates are going to operate. So today we see that most independent schools are at least outwardly questioning the exclusive nature of their schools, and they're considering their role in supporting a dominant white culture. Many PWISs have attempted to embrace and promote diversity by implementing various different, sorry for these updates, I can't manage to turn them off. I thought that I had. Anyway, we're trying to implement different programs to attract and retain and support underrepresented students. And these programs are widespread and cover a range of different types of ideas, but including transforming the curriculum to sort of reflect more global awareness and cultural competence and cultural literacy. But I think it's important that we still acknowledge that progress in these areas has been remarkably slow in terms of the numbers, as well as the structural supports that exist to ensure the equal treatment of all students. So change is happening, but more is undeniably needed. So this is a word cloud that draws from the text of 10 Mid-Atlantic independent school statements on DEIB. And it's just interesting to reflect on the common values that emerge from these word choices and their stated goals. And the focus of our work is to help independent schools bring these mission statements to life so that they're more than just words on a page. A primary goal is to help PWISs identify, acknowledge, and dismantle inequities within their school's policies and programs, and to better align the school's diversity practices with their mission statements, so that when you talk to students, their actual lived experiences and realities match all of the metaphors that we see around DEIB work. Okay, so in order to fully grapple with these challenges, it's important to listen to the voices of students of color in an independent school setting. And so one of the questions that we ask is, what does the scholarly research illuminate about these experiences? And hundreds of qualitative studies have been done where researchers have gone out and interviewed students and asked them about their school experience. And so we're going to talk about a little bit about that to give you that context, because a lot of the work that you would do within your own school has already happened elsewhere, and we can learn from those accounts as well. So just remember that engaging in that process of building a deeper understanding is really a key and fundamental step in our evidence-based practice. So this is, it's got a lot on here. It's a concept map. And it tries to distill decades of research about the experiences of underrepresented students in a predominantly white independent school. So I prepared this concept map to visually depict the connections between the theories and concepts and ideas that are articulated in the relevant research regarding the experiences of students of color in a PWIS. And there's a lot to unpack, but I'll just cover the highlights. In the top, in the blue, we have the theoretical lenses through which these topics were examined by scholars. In yellow off to the side, we see a lot of, off to the left, a lot of the factors within the institution itself that may influence the experience of underrepresented students. And we consider those factors against the backdrop of that history of exclusion that we were talking about within PWIS. On the right in black, there are multiple factors that researchers have found contribute to feelings of marginalization by non-white students in PWISs. And, you know, in various qualitative studies, African-American students described this dichotomy that they felt between experiencing a sense of belonging on the one hand and a sense of marginalization on the other hand at the same time, sort of highlighting how there are times when these students feel like outsiders and also at the same time enjoy and are very proud of their school affiliation. Some of the other sort of negative sentiments that were expressed were the feeling of being burdened by stereotypes or microaggressions, or being perceived to represent an entire race. So these factors just led to difficulties and stress that students have found or have stated that they find kind of differentiating between school and home and navigating those two different environments. So on the flip side, in green, the research has connected various factors that can help to mitigate these harmful effects and contribute to building a sense of belonging for students of color in independent schools. And we've listed some of them off to the side, but they're, you know, by no means an exhaustive list, but they include having affinity groups or exposure to faculty of color, healthy racial identities and peer relationships, curriculum, and so on. So the obvious objective is to be in that green section. And if marginalized students don't feel that established sense of school belonging, it can also serve to impede their school success. But on the other hand, you know, if students do feel connected to their school and valued by their school community, then the research shows that they will, and common sense, you know, tells us that people will tend to perform better in the school setting and be emotionally healthier. So our change initiative is rooted on an emphasis on the value proposition of having more faculty and administrative leaders of color in a PWIS as a clear driver of students' sense of belonging. So why does this problem of practice matter, and why do we as independent schools need to address it? We would submit that this problem of practice needs to be of paramount importance to the organization and to schools, because it has to be understood for independent schools to stay true to their stated values and diversity mission. It also helps to allow PWISs to attract and retain students from diverse populations, and to derive those evidence-based benefits of diversity, like increasing group performance, increasing student performance, encouraging innovation and creativity, because we know that diverse groups bring more innovation and more creativity to our schools. And schools can't derive the benefits that many voices bring to the organization if the people who are there and the underrepresented students do not feel welcomed and encouraged to participate. There are also practical economic reasons for action. Given anticipated changes in the demographic makeup of the United States over time, our schools need to be further motivated from a sustainability perspective to market themselves to a broader range of students, parents, teachers, and administrators. So these are just a couple of reasons. I know that there are others, but why this question is important and critical for independent schools to address. So just to be clear, our view is that all of these findings in the research and our experiences as people working in independent schools provides a moral imperative for us to act quickly and to strategically attempt to improve the experiences of our students of color in our school communities. All right, Carrie.
Thanks, Whitney. So now we're going to move on to part 2. Given that our shared understanding of this context, let's take a closer look at how we can tackle this problem of practice. So as a reminder, this is our problem. Some PWISs are struggling to live up to their mission to ensure that all students feel authentically known and valued in an inclusive educational setting and are being effectively prepared to participate in a dynamic and global society. And our goal here is to recommend achievable, sustainable, measurable strategies to help independent schools strengthen their efforts to build a culture of inclusion and foster a greater sense of belonging for the school's underrepresented students. Recall that the evidence that Whitney talked about illuminated that one way to get after this problem of practice is by addressing who populates our faculty and administration. This change initiative is rooted in an emphasis on the value proposition of having more faculty and administrative leaders of color in PWIS as a clear driver of students' sense of belonging. So this enables us to articulate our goal: to attract and hire a diverse faculty and administration, which enables all students to see themselves reflected and to feel a sense of belonging and inclusion within the school community. So what we want to do now is take a closer look at the evidence related to student outcomes for students of color who have teachers and some school leaders within their school of color. Students of color have demonstrated more positive perceptions of teachers of color, resulting in improved academic performance in the areas of motivation, interest, and grades. The research that we looked at specifically illuminates that personal effort, ambitions for college, and personal perceptions of engagement were also all elevated for students of color who have teachers of color. So perhaps the most powerful findings that we found in the research emerged from a 2018 set of studies by Egalite and Kisidia, which found that when students had teachers of the same race as them, they reported feeling more cared for, more interested in their schoolwork, and more confident in their teachers' abilities to communicate with them. Conversely, when students had teachers who didn't look like them, they reported lower levels of these feelings and attitudes. Frankenberg's 2009 research was relatively startling. It revealed that students of color were more harshly assessed on behavior in the classroom and subjective academic tasks by their white teachers in comparison to their white peers. When teachers of the same race evaluated the same students of color, the students fared more favorably. These trends were more visible in Black students, especially Black girls. So this evidence really lies at the heart of our incentive as PWIS for redesigning hiring practices. We like to sort of think of this as our why. Now, let's look at the research around current hiring practices. What are PWIS actually doing? And what does the evidence show us? And this will help us establish a better understanding of the primary levers we can move in order to impact the percentage of faculty and administrators of color at PWIS. So the research shows that independent schools' human resources practices related to DEIB often lack evidence-based strategy and methodical intentional approaches, which promote the probability of recruiting and retaining faculty of color. So despite the fact that many independent school leaders are driven by good intentions, independent schools profoundly struggle to effectively recruit and retain faculty of color. Consequently, people of color remain vastly underrepresented amongst independent school faculty and administrative leadership at many longstanding independent schools. So let's kind of break it apart a little bit more so we can really understand what's going on here. The ways in which educational institutions approach the process of recruiting employees is, it turns out, a really powerful predictor of outcomes related to successfully onboarding candidates of color. So as we mentioned, despite professed intentions to seek out and hire these individuals, the incorporation of evidence-based tools and techniques frequently loses out to long-time heuristics and human resources practices, which are efficient and familiar in the eyes of the organizational leaders. Research by Sensoy and D'Angelo in 2017 analyzed the recruitment and hiring of people of color in elite educational settings and found that while institutions actively will lament the struggle of diversifying their faculty, most of these organizations are actually engaged in hiring and screening practices which actively inhibit racial diversity. So they're not even operating from a neutral posture. They're essentially inadvertently doing things that are hurting the process. Applicant scrutiny and overall emphasis on the concept of fit, token hiring committee members, and interview protocols lacking a critical consciousness were all identified as flawed practices of recruitment procedures, which are driving towards this undesired outcome. So it's important to note here that we're not just talking about the ideas of building something better. We also have to kind of invert the narrative and think about deconstructing in order to rebuild. So along with the necessity for precise evidence-based intentional strategy for driving successful diversity hiring initiatives, scholars in the research coalesce around this need that I mentioned for the simultaneous deconstruction of informal codes of conduct which reproduce these long-standing patterns. This is really important. So essential to these efforts are three key ingredients that we uncovered in the research. The first is formalized frameworks, which monitor progress in diversity hiring and recruitment. This is in opposition to heuristics or unwritten codes of conduct. Second, a willingness by leadership to invest time and resources into an overhaul of current recruitment and hiring practices. And this requires some auditing that's going to take some time. And then finally, an investigation of post-hiring environments, which the research shows are recurrently characterized as being unwelcoming for people of color. So this all sounds really interesting. But how do we make it happen? How do we get going on it? How do we bridge the gap between theory and the scholarly research and the constraints, affordances and constraints of everyday practice, which we nodded to earlier? So we need to start by articulating that connective tissue between what the research indicates and what actions we will take to integrate it into our practice. This we're going to call our theory of change. Then we need to map out an actual plan, a roadmap, which is visually arrayed. And this is what we're going to refer to as our logic model. So essential to independent schools' success in this endeavor is a theory of change that is focused on current typical hiring practices. So our plan represents phase 1 of a change management model, driving toward a long-term outcome of full engagement in evidence-based practices in recruiting, hiring, and retaining faculty and administrators of color. Without systemic shifts in these hiring practices, PWIS will likely continue to be stymied in their efforts to achieve this strategic goal, despite their professed intentions. So the right side of the slide, the head, articulates our theory of change. It's an if-then statement. So under our theory of change, critical partners such as trustees, senior leadership, and department chairs must be willing to commit to devoting time and resources to this change initiative. We can't really overstate this. Decades of norms, traditions, and practices, which have really become part of our habitual ways of being in schools, are not easily undone. And so the need for consistent, compelling, and strategic leadership and broad stakeholder engagement is critical to success. This support is also critical to generating the funding and the human capital necessary to implement the following separate but overlapping strategies, which should work together to help schools achieve the desired impact on the community. And in this situation, we're framing this impact as follows: an increase in the overall percentage of administrators and faculty of color from 10% to 25% over 5 years. So we're throwing this out here as a sample metric. Each institution would have to arrive at their own aim based upon their current context, which would be, you'd want to have that aim be ambitious yet obtainable. So our theory of change is scaffolded by 6 key recommendations. And this is where we can start to really kind of wrap our arms around this whole idea. So take a moment to read through our first 3 recommendations, and I'll provide a little bit of insight into how we got there. So these evidence-based strategies require a thorough audit of current practices related to job descriptions, sourcing of employees, networking, advertising, screening, interview behaviors, search committee composition, and hiring decision-making processes. All of these factors are of utmost importance in recruiting faculty of color. And we know this because the research tells us it is so. Some practices may be currently happening in isolation at your school, or they might be utilized sort of intermittently here and there. The key here is synthesizing these strategies into a cohesive, logical model of improvement that over time can be durably integrated into practice. So here are our second set of recommendations, 4, 5, and 6. So this is really important to call out. It should be noted that the auditing of the current processes and practices might get a little uncomfortable. It's likely to reveal that certain individuals in an organization, or perhaps even one person, like a head of school or a division head, might have a highly disproportionate level of control over hiring practices, or that practices might be acted out in relative isolation during lull periods, such as the summer. An example practice might be internal hires and promotions being named within the organization without even announcing vacancies, or openly welcoming applicants. Whatever your audit of your school reveals, you need to anticipate that there's going to be discomfort or potential defensiveness about naming the ways in which practices and behaviors have traditionally been lived out. So here's where we are in our loop. As we overlay our recommendations into our practices, this requires the synthesis that I mentioned earlier, and this true reconciliation that Dr. Walters-Sachs also talked about of where we currently are and where we want to go. And perhaps the stickiest part of our change initiative, where the rubber really meets the road as we engage in the application of these appropriate research findings through the problem of practice, is lived out through the stakeholder behaviors within our organizations. So a logic model is a really, really nifty tool that helps depict a proposed change initiative and provide stakeholders with a roadmap describing a sequence of related events that connect to the needs assessment for the planned program within a program to obtain desired results. So logic models are used in all types of professional spaces and organizations. But for those who aren't familiar, we just wanted to kind of let you know what they are and how they work. They're actually really cool. So they can be interpreted by reading left to right, and they're made up of 5 key parts. Inputs represent the resources utilized in order to engage in a change initiative. Activities engage these resources in addressing the problem of practice. The outputs are the evidence or products resulting from these activities. And the outcomes are the changes. The changes anticipated in behavior, skills, and knowledge, which are produced as a result of engaging with this work. So this is the kind of tool we're using to articulate our change initiative, this logic model. So this is also a lot to unpack, kind of like Whitney's concept map. And you'll have access to the slides later. But this is also all curated from the research. And our logic model for this change initiative helps to depict the necessary steps in deconstructing and rebuilding PWIS's approach to recruiting and hiring faculty of color. The activities in the model are essential ingredients in bringing about the outcomes and eventual impact we want our schools to see over time. So you can kind of scan from left to right and get a sense of these different categories that we talked about earlier: inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. And keep in mind that all 4 steps in the logic model propel the change initiative forward towards a desired impact within the organization at large. So now I'm going to pass it over to Whitney to talk about change implementation and metrics for accountability.
Thanks, Carrie. As Dr. Grimes was going through it, I was thinking back to the first time when I heard or saw some of these concepts or these tools kind of used. And, working in a school, like all of you, I think we know that things are often very busy and fast paced. And so some of you may be thinking, these are tools that I may never use. And I had some of the same thoughts myself. But then one of the things that they do is they really sort of slow down your thinking and cause you to be very deliberate and reflective about what is the problem? Where are you going? How are we going to measure success? What precise steps are we going to take, and by when? And so I would encourage you to give them a shot, but then also just, and the more that you familiarize yourselves with the way that they work, the easier they become to work with. And then also just, even if we open ourselves up to thinking through these important topics in a very logical and methodical way, I think that our schools will be better served. And so while the logic model that Dr. Grimes was just talking about provides us with part of our blueprint for change, we have other tools at our disposal that can really help us try to wrap our minds around how does this change initiative get implemented. And we can conceptualize that work by connecting it to structures that are there to hold us accountable, like timetables or stakeholder maps or dashboards of key performance indicators or KPIs. So we're going to highlight some of those for you and specifically how they would work in connection with a project like this. One tool to assist with implementation of a change initiative is a timetable. So this would be the what are we going to do by when navigational tool for change. And a suggested time frame for a project like this might be about 12 months. So on this slide, we're showing that in 12 months, that would take us from through to the outputs and into the short-term outcome stages. But remember that to ensure success, a school needs to remain dedicated to that auditing process and the redesigning process, which can be lengthy. You may have to go back and forth and can also lead to those uncomfortable confrontations of norms and perpetuated infrastructures that may take a little bit of time to break down. So this discomfort is going to be an essential ingredient in growth and change and progress toward the targeted outcome, but also know that the deadlines are there just to hold us to a structure, but they sometimes need to change during the process as issues arise. Another really helpful tool is a stakeholder engagement map, and we've shown one here. So essential to the success of any change initiative is the process that we engage in to grapple with and answer the key questions around whatever our desired change is. And another very critical part of that process is to identify the specific roles that each of the various key stakeholders is going to play in that process. So the stakeholder map gives us the ability to articulate the essential questions that emerge from our recommendations and then to assign work to various stakeholder groups. And we recommend doing that in bite-sized chunks that are critical to redesigning these systemic processes and also to holding stakeholders accountable for the work that has been assigned to them. So note again the critical role that leadership plays here, and also just the broad array of different stakeholders who should be involved in the work, from students to board trustees. And that involvement on many different levels will nourish community partnerships around this very mission-centric endeavor. Another great tool is an evaluative tool like a balanced scorecard that can help track progress and then support next steps with respect to important areas. So, as all stakeholders are navigating through that process of change, this can be used as a tool to help us know if we're getting where we're meant to go. In this particular template, there are various KPIs, so key performance indicators that include addressing all of the key questions that we had around current hiring practices, data collection and the auditing and diagnosis of the problem, redesigning practices, and then integrating the evidence into our processes, and finally, implementation fidelity of our networking outreach and implementation fidelity of our recruitment processes. So these KPIs would be evaluated for progress across stakeholder groups again. Utilizing the tools of evaluation like these to mark progress and set priorities is really helpful to, hitting that last step that is, I'll call it last step, but the final step that may lead to starting all over again. But the step of evaluating and assessing the progress and to helping us commune thoughtfully with stakeholders and revisit any work that's incomplete. And all of this just helps ensure that the school is maintaining momentum in this iterative process. So engaging with these assessment tools will help create opportunities for deeper understanding and reflection in the school and dialogue, which will in turn help to build trust and establish new feedback loops for us for the sharing of information. So, after monitoring the effects of implementation practices to make sure that improvement's been made, the stage is then set for trying to incorporate all that we've learned into our regular and daily practice. Carrie, I think it's you.
Yeah, so we're just going to wrap up with some reflections and implications for ongoing work. So reflecting upon the design of our change initiative, the most impactful realization for us, and I'm sure we're not alone in this, is that DEIB work is incredibly complex and multi-layered and requires practitioners and school leaders to take time to understand what the research can teach us and to really reflect, use that research and our own data collection to really reflect upon the lived experiences of marginalized community members. We also feel like, as a general rule of thumb, by whittling down larger scale improvement aims to specific areas, like we zoomed right in on faculty and administration and hiring practices, out of all of the stuff that we had under our green part of our concept map, by focusing on a really specific area where the work can begin, the totality of the goal feels more manageable. And so these types of small wins are a really critical ingredient to evidence-based practice, but also to successful DEIB change implementation. So we did want to mention that there is a next part to this project and change initiative, and phase 2 of our project will tackle other key elements related to the retention of faculty and administrators of color. So, after all, recruitment and hiring is really just one part of the process. Once people enter your community, there's a whole other set of evidence that helps to guide us in ways that we can make them feel welcome and encourage them to stay. These objectives, which are also evidence-based, include things such as building and sustaining welcoming work environments for our colleagues of color, fostering mentoring and professional development opportunities for faculty and administrators of color that will help nourish peer networks, and engaging in programmatic design efforts that allow for the creative integration of our stakeholders of color across different constituency groups. So there's always more work to be done. So we just kind of want to part with a reminder that organizations don't come by change easily, and that change work, by its very nature, is actually never finished. Also, the forces of the status quo are incredibly powerful, and so that deconstructing process is a key step that it's going to take time, and it's going to take some real intentionality. So the principles of evidence-based practice really, as Dr. Walters-Sachs was saying earlier, they give us permission to reflect, design, and iterate inside of these ecosystems that drive our schools. Our shared dedication to evidence, intentionality, and collective effort are really essential to this kind of transformational work in our schools. So we were really honored to share our thoughts with you today. Thank you so much for your time and attention. We'll make sure the slides are available through the conference website, and that way you'll have the opportunity to bring these blueprints back to your own organizations. We also remind folks to feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn if you have follow-up questions or you want to share ideas or thoughts about this really, really important work. So now we are happy to open the floor if anybody has questions they'd like to send our way.
there's some references and resources in the presentation as well. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, we have a pretty meaty couple pages with all the references to the scholarly research that we drew upon. So I don't know, I can't really see people. So if people have questions, I guess just say them out loud would probably be the best way.
Hi,
Yeah.
I have a question. My name is Jessica Lewis. I am actually a college counselor from Notre Dame High School in the Los Angeles area. Thank you for this session. I appreciate it. My question, I guess, relates to, and I apologize, I did miss the beginning of it, so I'm not sure if it was covered, but for those of us that are not administrators, that are not decision makers, that are not, recruiters or reviewing resumes and applications, um, how do we influence those that are, other than saying, here's the slide or here's the recording of this great webinar I attended this afternoon? How do we get others that have that control to, for lack of better words, to do this? Even I think a little bit ago you said there's the intent to want to hire, but how can those of us that are teachers and counselors actually influence that?
Mhm. Whitney, do you want to take it or you want me to take it?
Sure. Well, I guess I would start by saying that one of the things that we've observed, which is why you probably heard it mentioned so many times, is the importance of having involvement across stakeholder groups. So ideally, our recommendation would be that when we form these interview committees or when we approach DEIB issues in general, that we have input not just from senior leadership, but input from our faculty, other administrators, staff, students, parents, from the community at large, rather than just having that power centered in a few key decision makers. I understand that that's not the reality at every single school, but I do think that ways in which we can try to, develop that for ourselves would be to put out our interest in contributing to and participating in this work. So if there are people who are more critically involved in it, I would express that interest, because a lot of times, that's sort of how I think it organically happens within organizations. People don't necessarily go out and solicit that input from everyone. But when someone raises their hand and says, I'd love to be involved, now you've made that intention known. That's one that pops to mind. I don't know, Carrie, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I think that even if one doesn't perceive oneself as having power within the organization, you have connections with individuals that do have power. And so I think it's important to use your voice if you're, let's say, a middle manager or a faculty member, to reach out to your department chair or your supervisor and let it be known that you care about this work, and if you wanted to share this information that you've gathered at this conference. The other thing I would really encourage is that you are intentional about forging a legitimate connection with the DEIB practitioners within your school. So even though it might not seem that the college counselor or the art teacher have a logical ongoing through line to the work of the DEIB practitioners in our schools, you do. And so find ways to ally yourself with those individuals and partner on some projects together so that you can start to build that important relationship. And in doing so, you are creating the connective tissue that we referred to, right? So if you find ways to cleverly partner and put out a program with your director of DEIB on something where you have shared interest or shared motivation, and that is put out to the community and people engage, you're building that connective tissue that helps kind of drive the larger initiatives that you may not have as much power or influence over forward. I sort of like to think of it in this way. Just like every member of a school community at this point feels they have a responsibility to positively market the school. You know, the admissions and enrollment management professionals in our schools have taught teachers how to be frontline marketers. When families come tour the school, when you have a shadow student coming in your classroom, all the professionals at an independent school have a similar call to participate in this important work in the large and small ways that they can within their roles. So yeah, hopefully that sheds a little light on that.
It does. Thank you both.
Yeah, sure. Carrie, something that you said made me think of, because you have a better memory than I do, but of something that we, some research that we saw in the leadership context of the people, like just the leaders are often not sort of the most obvious within an organization, but rather those people who they're the connectors, or the people who they know the most people, or they talk to the most people, or and when you said that, I was reminded of just you know, the notion that we shouldn't ever undersell our own leadership abilities or position within an organization, because title alone doesn't, you know, isn't what a leader makes, or isn't all that a leader encompasses. And so thinking of yourself as a leader within the school, regardless of title, I think is an important step to kind of taking a more active role in you know, in areas that may not so obviously overlap with your day-to-day.
Other questions? Pamela?
Yes, I was wondering if you have any comments about the integration of these change goals when schools choose to undertake a strategic planning initiative and or maybe are going through an accreditation process. And are there any attributes of this process that help drive the process forward during those times when schools may have external pressures to create change, and yet some of those pressures are sometimes, like you said, sort of fraught with the tension of maintaining doing some things so that you see your strengths, and not seeing that the change and implementation of these, when you're perhaps hiring a consultant, are jeopardized?
I think it's really important. First of all, thank you for your thoughtful, reflective question, Pamela. I think it's important to be able to put forward the intersection of strategic goals. So for example, an accreditation, a strategic plan, a change initiative around DEIB work, there should be a pretty significant area of that Venn diagram that meets. And so looking for those pressure points where incentives are aligned because multiple objectives are being achieved, I think is a critical and important discernment aspect of tackling this kind of change initiative. I hazard to guess that many strategic plans that are going to be rolling out in the next 6 to 18 months will have heavy weight put towards DEIB. And so I think that looking for those areas of incentive alignment where a trustee's incentives can be directly aligned with the incentives of other stakeholders in the community, and therefore this sort of synergistic momentum is derived, is one thing to think about. with regards to your question. Whitney, what do you think in terms of the challenge that Pamela's, it's really that going back to sort of that scarcity of resources, human resources in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think it also sort of ties in with just the overall goal of having what we put down in the strategic plan or what we state as our mission really coming to life. And I understand, of course, that when the school is going through an accreditation process, that resources are going to probably shift focus in terms of, making sure that, keeping the school open being the primary goal and then addressing everything else being secondary. But the hope is that, I mean, every 5 or 10 years, we're going to go through that process. But in the meantime, as we try to meet those strategic goals that we set for ourselves as an institution, this kind of doing it in a way that's sort of very step by step and deliberate, I think can help translate what are just maybe goals on a piece of paper into action. And as I think Carrie talked a little bit about like those small wins. So those small wins kind of beget larger ones. And I think as we start to see small wins in particular areas, that gives encouragement to people to continue to kind of move forward and to devote those resources that they might otherwise put somewhere else.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think there's also a lot to be said for fully leveraging this moment. We're existing in a moment when there happens to be wind behind this sail, right? Because of all the things that have gone on in our country in the last several months. And so taking full advantage of that and doing everything that you can in your daily practice to uphold the DEIB professionals at your school, even if that's just through informal interaction where you offer support and feedback and offer participation as you're able. I think those types of efforts matter when you're sitting on a pivot moment where people are paying attention to this, right? We sort of don't want to let this moment get away from us without each doing what we can to collectively have an impact. Other questions? There was an interesting question that dropped in the chat. I think Julia left, but given these findings, do you think white educators should seek schools with majority white students? Are there ways for white teachers to cultivate truly safe, positive classroom spaces in majority POC schools? How can white educators who do not play a role in hiring have influence? So, Whitney, do you want to take the first jump at this one?
Sure. Well, I think that we tried already to tackle the second piece of that in terms of, exerting our individual influence. I think what we sort of tackled in this work is the predominantly white independent school setting. And so, I would say that I would like to say that yes, well, I would hope that there are certainly ways for white teachers to cultivate truly safe and positive classroom spaces in majority POC schools, and that the reverse is true as well, that it's equally possible for people of faculty of color to cultivate those spaces in predominantly white schools. I mean, there's tons of research that is probably speaks to both of those. But what we were talking about is sort of in the predominantly white independent school setting, how do we as educators, whether white or non-white, cultivate an inclusive educational environment? So I wouldn't advocate that white educators seek particular schools. To me, that seems like a personal preference. I think that, as educators, we should try to figure out ways in which we can cultivate those inclusive environments exactly where we are.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing that you said, Whitney. I just want to put a button on it before we close, is that our research is exclusively curated from studies about privileged white independent schools and elite institutions of higher education. Some of the research is pulled from that space as well. And so what you're going to find is that there's, the scholarly research around other types of schools, whether they be religious-based schools, public or charter schools. You're going to find a whole other swath of research that would help illuminate strategies in those spaces. So yeah, I think that, and we're happy to take any other questions, but I want to respect people's time, and please know that, we're available after the fact if you want to reach out and just chat about ideas and innovations that you're tinkering with in your school environments. But it was our pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah, thank you everybody for being here. I just think that the more that we engage in dialogue as educators and within our school communities, the better that we are. It's less important that we have all the right answers or know all of the research, but that we just sort of open up the lines of communication and engage in that back and forth, which I think is critical to building trust in our school communities and really getting at what makes people feel included in the school environment. And without those conversations, we can't truly understand what it is that motivates people or how we can better respond to and address their needs. So this is just one small step in what I hope is, a larger and ongoing conversation that we're all having about DEIB work. And I'm feel very grateful to have had the opportunity to exchange some ideas with all of you.